For those that don't know, I am a noob to the John Wick franchise. In fact, I recently watched the entire series for the first time all the way through in preparation for Chapter 4's release. And full disclosure, I'm not a big John Wick fan. But I went into Chapter 4 hoping that the theater experience alone might change the way that I look at these movies. Unfortunately, if I'm being honest, I ended up feeling the same way about Chapter 4 that I felt about the other 3 movies. Let's discuss.
I watch so you don't have to.
Before I get started, I'd like to kindly ask that you hit the like button, and please subscribe to the channel for more content just like this.
All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
John Wick Chapter 4 follows legendary hitman John Wick, of course, who has an ever-growing price on his head, so he decides to take his fight against the High Table Global as he seeks out the most powerful individuals in the underworld. Okay, right off the bat, I have to bring this up because it was a huge issue I had with the third movie. And this movie begins by kind of glossing over how John Wick isn't dead after the events of Chapter 3. Not only that, but this movie, Chapter 4, kind of doubles down on him being this indestructible force that can't be hurt.
And it absolutely will not stop, ever, until you are dead.
There's actually another scene in this movie towards the end where no normal person could possibly survive what happens to him. Actually, there's 2 scenes like that towards the end of this movie. And this is one of my biggest issues with this franchise. A franchise that once had very humble and grounded beginnings. In typical modern blockbuster fashion, they have to keep outdoing themselves by putting John Wick in crazier and crazier situations. But in effect, it feels like they've kind of lost their way, both from a logic and from a storytelling perspective. Because everything in the movie feels so absurd. And yes, that's probably intentional, but in the end it makes it difficult for me to care about what's going on. And at no point during this movie did I ever feel like John Wick was in any kind of danger. Don't get me wrong, the action sequences are great to look at, as always, and are easily the highlight of every John Wick movie. But once you get past that, I'm not sure there's much there to keep my interest. And I think that's where I personally start to run into problems.
How can you not care?
Like this.
Now, typically the world building stuff would be the other highlight to these movies, but even that felt a bit underwhelming this time around. There was one kind of cool new inclusion that involved setting the rules for a duel and how they go about doing that in this world. But outside of that, there wasn't a lot of fresh ideas to add to the mythos.
Not impressed.
If you watched my previous video, I also took issue with the lack of memorable villains in this franchise. Something that John Wick 4 I think at least tries to correct. Donnie Yen plays a anti-hero type character. He's not really evil, he's not really the enemy, he's just kind of doing what he has to do to survive. Here's a question, do you think they make Donnie Yen's characters blind, like in Rogue One and in this movie, because he's so good at what he does physically that they have to even the playing field with everybody else in the movie? It is starting to feel that way.
I'm one with the force is with me.
And then we have the Scott Adkins character, who is memorable, but for all the wrong reasons. He's almost unrecognizable, he's wearing a lot of prosthetics, and he has a somewhat over-the-top performance that makes him feel more like a Batman villain than someone that John Wick would be encountering. And then we have Bill Skarsgård, Pennywise himself, who I thought would be this movie's saving grace.
Yeah, you know what? You thought wrong.
I will say that he felt a bit more formidable and more intimidating than previous John Wick villains, but ultimately he still felt a bit underutilized considering what we know about Bill Skarsgård as an actor. It felt like the script to this movie let him down. Speaking of the script, I don't know if this is a written dialogue problem or a Keanu Reeves problem. But why the hell does Keanu Reeves sound so wooden in this movie? I mean, more wooden than usual. But I know for a fact that I've seen him show more range than this.
What do you do? What do you do?
Plus, I don't remember him talking this way so robotically in the first John Wick movie. Like, is this their way of showing us that him getting the shit kicked out of him and dropped off of buildings for 4 movies did actually take a toll on him? It could be that, I suppose, but I'm more inclined to believe that it has more to do with the dialogue that is being written. Okay, I know what you're all thinking right now. I'm thinking too much, and it caused me to not enjoy this movie. And while that may be true, I don't think that makes any one of these criticisms any less valid.
Boo this man!
Again, I'm not really looking at this from a fan perspective like a lot of people are. I'm taking a much more critical approach. The action set pieces and choreography are great as always. Some things do require you to suspend your disbelief, which is expected at this point for a franchise like this. But I can get past those things because action movies typically have a bigger is better mentality when it comes to sequels.
That makes sense.
There's actually a few really good action scenes in this movie. One that involves an overhead tracking shot that must have taken a lot of time to pull off and was quite impressive. And there's this fight up a very long flight of steps that was entertaining, even if the conclusion of that fight did feel a bit ridiculous.
What the hell am I looking at? When does this happen in the movie?
Another highlight of this movie is John once again getting hit with this endless wave of enemies coming to collect on that contract that's on his head. As he's trying to escape through the streets of Paris, we get a Warriors reference, because throughout the sequence we have a radio DJ who's pretty much giving us a play-by-play. I thought that was pretty cool that they were paying homage to one of my favorite movies.
Warriors, come out to play.
There's also this big shootout in the middle of a very busy street. But even with all this great action going on, I would still stop and think to myself, if John Wick was just a bit more discreet about how he travels from place to place, none of this would have happened. I guess if John Wick doesn't just casually walk down the streets, we wouldn't have much of a movie now, would we? Even if that makes no sense logically.
I don't get it.
The finale of this movie was beautifully shot, and it plays out very much like an old school western. The resolution to that conflict did feel a bit too neat, in my opinion. And again, similar to the ending of John Wick 3, which I also had an issue with, I can't say that it was 100% satisfying in its execution. Also, I need to point out that this movie is almost 3 hours long, which does seem a bit overindulgent for something like this. And I'm pretty sure they could have accomplished the same thing in a 2-hour movie and nobody would have known the difference.
Don't waste my time!
Listen, some may consider this review to be nitpicky, and I know that these movies have a very loyal fan base, and honestly I wish I liked them more than I do. I would venture to say that if you're a fan of the other John Wick movies, you will probably like this one. But for me, there's just something about them that causes me not to connect with them. To me, they've lost all of their humanity. They've lost all their realism.
What is real? How do you define real?
At the beginning of this story, you got the feeling that this underworld could exist in our world. But now by chapter 4, it feels like they've ventured into this cartoon world. In fact, I don't think that John Wick 1 and John Wick 4 feel like they're in the same universe. It feels that far removed from where this all began. They do try to add an emotional core to this film, both with Donnie Yen's situation with his family as well as his relationship with John Wick. But in a world like this, where it feels like nothing matters, it's going to take a lot to get me invested in these stories, and to me they just didn't do enough. Was John Wick Chapter 4 a terrible movie? No, it wasn't. Unfortunately, I just felt next to nothing while watching it, and that's why I'm going to give it the Careless Sam Gerard.
I don't care! Y'all be cool. Right on.